Welcome to this Tutor to You sociology topic video on educational policy and social class inequality. Educational policy is a term that is given to any government initiative that's main purpose is to change the education system in some way. An example of this is the 1988 Education Reform Act, which had the aim of raising standards in education. Often on the exams you may see this term on questions, or you may see the term social policy. It's important to be able to understand the difference between the two, as you may not get credited on questions that ask for educational policies if you use a social policy as an example. Social policy is a more generic term for a policy or a law that is put forward by government. If the main aim of the policy is not geared towards education, then you would not get credited for it should the question be asking for educational policies, even if it does have an indirect impact on education. For example, policies such as the Equal Pay Act or the Sex Discrimination Act may have led indirectly to raising girls' aspirations, but that was not its main aim. Its main aim was geared towards employment. In this video, we're going to look at some of the educational policies that have looked to tackle social class inequality in education. While policies such as the introduction of minimum wage or living wage may tackle inequality, it's not an educational policy and has no direct impact on educational achievement. We are purely looking at policies that have been introduced to change something in education, particularly cut the gap between social classes. One thing to note in questions on educational policies is whether or not the question is asking you about policies over a certain time period. So, for example, often questions will ask you for policies over the last 20, 30 or 40 years. In this instance, some of these policies would not gain you credit, but in the absence of any time period or reference to contemporary education, you can use them. One of the earliest policies that attempted to tackle social inequality through addressing equality of opportunity was the Tripartite System in 1944. Introduced as part of wide-ranging reforms brought into the UK as part of the Beveridge Report, the Tripartite System was introduced in the post-war period, with students required to sit an aptitude test at age 11 called the 11+. Based upon the results of this test, students would be placed into one of three different schools: grammar schools, technical schools or secondary moderns. By offering students a place based upon their ability, this policy in theory gave all students the opportunity to go to a grammar school should they pass the test. If they failed, they were placed in a secondary modern school. Theoretically, those who showed an aptitude for technical skills could be placed into a technical college. However, in reality, very few of these were built. Critics of the tripartite system suggested that the 11+ was culturally biased, and inequality of outcome existed as students in grammar schools were prepared for academia, while those in secondary moderns were pushed towards more vocational routes. In the 1960s, comprehensive schools came to replace the tripartite system throughout most of the country. Comprehensives were based upon equality of opportunity and equality of access, with selection by ability being banned and schools taking in students from their local areas. These new schools did, however, have internal selection policies such as setting, streaming and banding, and thus did not always result in equality of outcome for students. Critics also suggest that schools in middle-class areas had an intake of middle-class students and therefore performed better than schools in working-class areas. However, the comprehensive model still remains. Despite many state comprehensives converting to academies, they are in essence comprehensives, as there are no overt selection policies evident. Throughout the Conservative government in 1979 to 1997, the main focus of education was arguably the marketisation of education, typified by the 1988 Education Reform Act, and the introduction of league tables and Ofsted. While some may argue that raising standards in schools was an attempt to tackle inequality, many sociologists have suggested that Conservative policy was more geared towards giving the middle class an advantage in education. However, in 1992, former polytechnic colleges were granted university status, which gave a greater opportunity of access to students from lower social class backgrounds, and with increased achievement from schools following the reforms to education, this broadened the higher education marketplace. However, critics would suggest that this was not to address inequality, but rather an expansion of marketisation policies. The new Labour government from 1997 to 2010 is most linked with educational policy that tackled inequality. The term compensatory education became synonymous with New Labour policy as it looked to tackle inequality in society. Sure Start centres were created based upon a number of similar projects in the USA that gave parents access to early learning for their children through parent-child groups to teach children skills they needed to start school and provide intermediate support to parents in need. Researchers suggested that working-class students started school several years behind their peers in speech and language development, so Sure Start was created to give those children a sure start to their education. A second policy was the introduction of Education Maintenance Allowance, or EMA, a means-tested allowance for children of low-income families to enable them to stay in education after the age of 16. This was introduced to counteract students who sought the immediate gratification of work or welfare benefits to demonstrate that education pays. New Labour also introduced city academies, the merger of failing schools in inner city areas that attracted additional funding in setting up, having new buildings, additional resources, and will run independently of the local education authority. These were initially successful, and despite being a policy to promote inequality, can also be seen as a policy that continued the marketisation of education introduced by the Conservatives, so a useful policy to know for exam purposes. Labour also acted to reduce class sizes in primary schools, with many oversubscribed schools having classes cut to less than 30 pupils at primary level. They also started a programme of building new schools, many through privately funded initiatives, to tackle oversubscription and the decline of existing properties, while they also extended the leaving age of students to 18, mostly to tackle the problem of 16 to 24-year-old NEETs, not in education, employment or training. However, many of these initiatives were overturned by the coalition government between 2010 and 2015, with the closure of the majority of Sure Start centres and the removal of EMA. The new schools building programme was also shut down, with many schools left unfinished as the economy worsened and austerity policies were introduced. However, due to the precarious nature of the coalition between Conservatives and Liberal Democrats in the early years, Liberal Democrats were able to introduce some policies to tackle inequality, such as pupil premium, and additional payment made to schools for pupils from areas of deprivation. Furthermore, they introduced universal free school meals for students up to the age of 7, tackling some of the impacts of material deprivation. What we also have to be able to do is ask, how effective were these policies? The tripartite system was criticised as the majority of students in the grammar schools were middle class. While some working class students did excel in the grammar schools and gained educational and social capital, many more were deemed to be no-hopers and were shipped off to secondary moderns at the age of 11. The comprehensive system, while theoretically offering equality of outcomes, in reality saw a great difference between those in the higher and lower sets. It was suggested that both EMA and Sure Start were not targeting those most in need, and so were removed or reduced significantly, with Sure Start centres today operating in only the most deprived of areas and on a far more limited scale, while EMA was removed when the school leaving age was raised to 18. The City Academies programme evolved into converter academies, and many secondary schools have undergone academisation since the expansion of the programme under the coalition government. However, there have been accusations of increasing social inequality through operating covert selection methods, such as increased uniform costs and off-rolling of problem students so they don't impact on results. The Conservative expansion of universities has also been criticised as a measure not to offer equality of opportunity, but instead to create a higher education market, and this criticism has increased with the increase of tuition fees to over £9,250 a year. Education has also faced cuts under austerity measures introduced by successive governments, with many schools reliant upon parents' associations to fill in gaps in funding and source additional income. With 1 in 3 children in the UK living below the poverty line, education has been hit particularly hard by economic policy over the last 10 years. That concludes this Tutor to You Sociology topic video on educational policy and social class inequality. Thanks for watching.